The room with red curtains was silent, save for the slow creaking of a fan turning overhead. The drapes, heavy velvet, fluttered despite the windows being locked tight. It was the kind of room meant for quiet conversation and whiskey in cut-glass tumblers, not for death. Yet death had come. It was Colonel Harold Godfrey who found the body, or rather what was left of it. He had returned from his morning walk along the riverside to discover his old friend, Professor Lionel Ashcroft, slumped in an armchair beneath the south-facing window. Ashcroft's spectacles were still perched crookedly on his nose, his eyes wide open and frozen in some final terror. There was no blood, no visible wound, no signs of struggle, only the slight burn mark at the base of his neck, where a small circular patch of skin had turned an angry red, almost black. The police were called at once. Inspector Armitage, a methodical man with the patience of a chess player and the soul of an accountant, examined the room inch by inch. There was no sign of forced entry. All doors had been locked from the inside. The windows, 3 in total, had been bolted, their edges sealed with dust that had not been disturbed. There was no weapon, no note, and no indication of any third party's presence. Ashcroft's watch had stopped precisely at 9:47 a.m., though Armitage couldn't determine if that was the time of death or merely a mechanical failure. The housemaid, Elsie Trent, insisted she had heard nothing. She had been in the kitchen since 8 a.m., and the colonel had returned from his walk at precisely 10. The professor was alive when I brought in his tea tray, she said. That was just after 9. He thanked me as always. Very polite, he was. It wasn't long before the newspapers got hold of it. Cambridge scholar dies in locked study, screamed the headlines. No entry, no exit, no explanation. Armitage hated the press. They turned every puzzle into a circus. The colonel, distressed and pacing like a man twice his age, had sent word to an old acquaintance. A woman who had solved more impossible cases than the Yard dared admit. Miss Harriet Vane arrived the following morning, her keen grey eyes scanning the red, curtained room with quiet intensity. Her arrival was met with polite skepticism from Armitage, who had learned to tolerate amateurs but not to trust them. What strikes you most? She asked after her first circuit of the room. That there's nothing to strike me, Armitage replied. It's too tidy. Too convenient. She knelt near the chair and studied the odd mark on Ashcroft's neck. And yet something killed him. Something precise. This mark, it's almost like a burn. Not electrical, though. Too small, too clean. You said no objects were found nearby? Nothing that could have caused it. No chemicals, no tools. The ashtray has yesterday's cigarette. The whiskey glass is clean. The curtains are curious, she mused. Such a bold choice? Did the colonel mention them? They were the professor's, said the light helped him think. Armitage's expression darkened. Odd taste. Harriet stepped closer to the windows. Her fingers brushed the fabric, then slid along the sash lock. Dust undisturbed. No fingerprints. She peered down 3 stories. A sheer drop, no chance of an entry from outside. And yet, later that evening, she sat with the colonel in the study. He was clutching a brandy glass, his knuckles white. Was Lionel working on anything unusual? She asked. Unusual? He laughed bitterly. Everything he did was unusual. But lately, yes, he'd been meeting with someone. A woman, I think. Young, foreign perhaps. He was evasive about her. Kept saying he'd stumbled on something dangerous in his research. It was never clear what, only that it involved optics and perception. I thought it was just academic posturing. What kind of optics? Light? Lasers, maybe. Refraction? I don't know. He stood and poured another drink. He did say he'd had the curtains specially treated. Treated? To reduce glare. Said it created a controlled environment. He waved a hand vaguely. All gibberish to me. Harriet's brow furrowed. She stood again, returning to the windows, the red velvet, the strange quality of light in the room. It was warmer, almost oppressive. The professor had wanted this room to behave in a very specific way. At midnight, she returned to the study alone. The police had long since departed. The colonel retired to bed. Harriet sat in the professor's chair. The room was still, silent. Then she noticed the brass lamp on the desk, its bulb unusually shaped. She switched it on. A thin beam of light cut across the room like a knife, catching the edge of the curtain. A soft hum, nearly inaudible, vibrated through the air. She sat perfectly still. A click, then the sound of static. Harriet stood slowly and reached for the curtain's hem. Tucked just behind it was a narrow lens, mounted on a delicate mechanism. It was warm to the touch. A concealed laser, the burn mark, the exact timing. The precision. Harriet switched the lamp off. The hum ceased. The curtain settled. She didn't sleep. By morning Armitage was back, tired but alert. Well, he asked. The room was the weapon, she said simply. Ashcroft created a setup, a focused light beam that turned lethal. The curtains acted as a filter, narrowing and amplifying the beam. When the light passed through at just the right time of day, aligned perfectly, it killed him. Accident then? No. Her voice was cold. Sabotage. That lens behind the curtain was adjusted. By someone who knew exactly what would happen. And who would know? Why need to find this mysterious woman the Colonel mentioned? If she exists, she's our only real suspect. Harriet turned back to the red curtains, now drawn wide to let in the daylight. Whatever had happened in that room, it was no accident. The crime had been too clean, too invisible. The room with red curtains had become a murder weapon, and someone had made sure it fired on time. Harriet Vane waited in the morning light, the warmth of tea between her palms doing little to soothe her thoughts. The room with red curtains had given up its first secret, but secrets rarely came alone. The lens behind the curtain hadn't simply materialized. It had been placed with precision, with intent. She had spent part of the night cross, referencing scientific text on beam alignment and photonic focusing, confirming what she already suspected. Lionel Ashcroft had designed a sophisticated mechanism. But someone else had turned it into a trap. Inspector Armitage returned just past 9, notebook in hand, his movements sharp and clipped. No sign of any woman matching the Colonel's description. We've asked neighbors, the college porter, even the librarian. Nothing yet. She wouldn't have left a name. Harriet replied. She wouldn't need to. Not if she knew him well enough to visit privately. You think it's personal. I think it's calculated. And that's always personal, in one way or another. Armitage grunted. We've called in a scientific consultant from the university. Former student of Ashcroft's. Should be here shortly. Thought you might find him useful. Harriet said nothing, though she doubted the usefulness of a student explaining to her what she already knew. Still, any fresh pair of eyes could help. When the young man arrived, he entered the room with an air of cautious reverence. He was slight wary, with a nervous energy that made Harriet watch him closely. He removed his hat, glanced at the curtains, and then let his gaze drop to the precise spot where Ashcroft had died. Edward Lonsdale, he said, nodding to Armitage and then Harriet. I studied under Professor Ashcroft for 4 years. He was meticulous, demanding, not a man given to error. Did you know what he was working on recently? Harriet asked. Lonsdale hesitated. Light projection. Narrow band amplification. He was experimenting with using colored filters and micro lenses to amplify ambient light into precise, high-intensity beams. Something to do with energy conservation. Very ahead of its time. Harriet watched him carefully. Could such a beam cause harm? In theory, yes. If concentrated enough, it could burn through paper. Skin too. But that would take incredible focus. I mean, this setup, he motioned vaguely to the curtain, as elegant. But weaponizing it would require obsessive calibration. So you're saying it was possible, but unlikely to be accidental. Highly unlikely, Lonsdale said, frowning. Professor Ashcroft knew what he was doing. Harriet nodded. And would he have trusted someone else with this work? No one comes to mind. Lonsdale shifted uncomfortably. He didn't work well with others. Did he mention anyone unusual? A collaborator? Perhaps there was a woman. I saw her once in the corridor outside his lab. Red coat. Foreign accent. She looked out of place. I assumed she was from the embassy, Russian or Eastern European maybe. Harriet and Armitage exchanged a glance. She left no name. None that I ever heard. But I do remember something strange. Ashcroft seemed afraid after she visited. Paranoid almost. He changed the locks on the lab. Stopped taking students. Even stopped attending faculty dinners. Thank you, Dr. Lonsdale. That's helpful. After he left, Armitage sighed and looked to Harriet. You think this is espionage? No, she said slowly. I think it's betrayal. Someone Ashcroft trusted, or needed, came too close to his discovery. And either out of fear or jealousy, they decided to silence him. Harriet turned back to the desk, scanning it once more. The brass lamp still sat at its precise angle. The whiskey glass, empty and cleaned, seemed too deliberate. Then her eye caught something. The coaster beneath the glass. It bore a faint watermark, not circular but elliptical. Larger than the base of the glass. Harriet bent closer. It didn't match the professor's usual tumbler. Someone else had used a different glass, recently. She stood and crossed to the side table. 4 glasses rested on a silver tray, each identical to Ashcroft's. Colonel Godfrey, she called. Could I trouble you for a moment? He appeared in the doorway, clearly tired, the lines of grief etched into his brow. Of course. Miss Vane. Anything? You said you were with Ashcroft last night. Yes, we had a drink around 8, talked about old times. He seemed distracted. Which glass did you use? He blinked, unsure. This one, I suppose. He picked up a tumbler from the tray. Harriet returned to the desk. Then who used the larger glass? There's a mark here. Fresh. The Colonel stared. I don't know. Perhaps Elsie brought an extra one. Harriet turned. Elsie, could you come here, please? The housemaid entered nervously, wiping her hands on her apron. Did you bring in an extra glass last night? No, ma'am. Just the 2, like always. One for the Colonel. One for the Professor. Was anyone else in the study after? Elsie hesitated, then flushed. There was someone here 2 days ago. After dinner, I saw her leaving. She came through the side door. Quiet like, I didn't say anything. Professor Ashcroft said not to. Harriet stepped closer. Describe her. Dark hair tied up, long red coat. Tall, with a way of walking like she didn't want to be seen. She had an accent. Something foreign, but I didn't catch it. And you're certain she had a drink? Yes. I found an extra glass in the sink later that night. Bigger than the others. Harriet turned to Armitage. We need to find that glass. It might have prints. They searched the bin and found it, cracked but intact. Larger than the others. Armitage wrapped it carefully. She left her mark. Harriet murmured. Now we need to find her name. But it wasn't just the glass that unsettled her. As they moved through the study, she noticed something strange in the pattern of dust along the baseboards. 2 smudged footprints, very faint, near the bookcase. Odd, considering the room was rarely used except for sitting and study. She knelt beside the case. One shelf had a book, slightly askew, Optical Pathways in Closed Systems. She pulled it gently, and to her surprise it moved the shelf a fraction. A hidden latch clicked. The bookcase creaked outward by ½ an inch. Inside was a narrow cabinet, empty save for one item, a letter, folded carefully in a blue envelope. Harriet drew it out. The envelope was unmarked. She opened it. The letter was in Ashcroft's hand. If anything happens to me, know that it was not chance. The lens has been altered. I suspect she is watching me still. Her name, if she gave it truly, is Vieira. She claimed to want peace, but the precision of her questions tells me otherwise. I fear I've built something she will use again. Forgive me. The first sign of deception had arrived. Harriet folded the letter, her pulse steady, her thoughts racing. Someone had been playing a longer game than anyone suspected. And now that someone knew, they were being hunted. Harriet Vane stood with the letters still in her hand, the red curtains now parted to let in a pale, uncertain light. Ashcroft had feared the woman named Vieira. That alone marked her as more than an eccentric visitor. And yet, she'd left no name, no trace save a foreign accent, an oversized glass, and a ghost of a presence in the dust. Whoever Vieira was, she had crossed into Lionel Ashcroft's life with precision and left with bloodless murder behind her. Inspector Armitage read the letter twice, lips pursed. Well, that gives us something to chase, if we can find her. Do you believe she used her real name? I doubt it, Harriet replied. But Ashcroft was careful with language. If she gave it truly, he wrote. He wasn't sure. But he suspected her deeply enough to leave a letter hidden behind a false shelf. That speaks volumes. Still, Armitage muttered, we've got a red coat, a foreign accent, a broken glass, and a possible name. It's thin. Then we stretch it, Harriet said calmly, starting with those who were close to Ashcroft, and eager to distance themselves. Colonel Godfrey was summoned again, less harried now but visibly restless. He held his hat like a man expecting judgment. You said Ashcroft mentioned a woman, Harriet said, watching him. Yes, he nodded, sitting stiffly. In passing, I only brought it up because he seemed bothered by her. Did he give you a name? No, just that she was clever. Too clever. He said she asked the kind of questions that aren't asked innocently. And you didn't press him. He hesitated. No, Lionel was private. We all are. We value our peace. Harriet paused, letting the silence stretch. Colonel, she said softly, when was the last time you saw the woman? His eyes flickered. I never saw her. Ilse says otherwise. She saw a woman leaving through the side door 2 days before the murder. His mouth tightened. I didn't want to make assumptions. She was drinking whiskey in the study. That's not an assumption. Colonel Godfrey stared at the floor, then sighed. Fine, I saw her. Once, I didn't speak to her. She came down the stairs as I entered through the back. Ashcroft was furious. Told me I had no right walking in without knocking, even though I've always had a key. I said nothing. I left. Harriet frowned. Why not tell us this before? I didn't think it mattered. You didn't think a strange woman, leaving in secret 2 nights before a murder, mattered. I didn't think she'd killed him. He snapped, then caught himself. I'm sorry. I'm tired. Harriet regarded him coolly. We all are. She let him go. Elsie was next. Her apron wrung between her hands. She answered quickly, nervously, almost too easily. Yes, I saw her. No, I didn't know her name. She never spoke to me, just nodded. She wore gloves, red ones. Looked expensive. She moved like she knew the house, not fumbling about like guests do. Did you see her more than once? Harriet asked. Elsie hesitated. Maybe. Once more, just a glimpse. I heard voices the night before the professor died. Not loud. A low argument, like they didn't want to be overheard. Did you hear what was said? Only one bit? He said. I won't let you use it. She replied something like, then someone else will. Why didn't you tell us this earlier? I didn't want to get in trouble. I thought, Maybe it was just academic stuff. Nothing dangerous. Harriet nodded slowly. And yet you said nothing after he was dead. I thought maybe she'd come back. I was afraid. The maid's fear didn't seem feigned, but fear could come from guilt too. Still, Harriet filed the phrase away, then someone else will. A threat, or a promise. Later that afternoon, Armitage returned with news. We've traced a woman with a red coat matching that description to a boarding house on Rosebery Street. Registered under the name Verakova. Russian passport, but we can't verify the details. She's already left. Took her things yesterday, just after news of Ashcroft's death broke. She was watching. Harriet murmured. She knew he was dead almost immediately. They visited the boarding house. The landlady was cooperative to a fault, a florid woman who spoke as if every detail held a secret drama. Very polite. That one paid on time. Room always tidy. Never spoke to the other girls. Had a typewriter but never used it. Kept to herself. Except for the man who visited last week. Harriet and Armitage both looked up. What man? Armitage asked. Tall, thin, spectacles. Looked academic. Didn't give his name. But she didn't look pleased to see him. Harriet stepped closer. Could you describe him again? The woman tried. Sharp nose. Bit of a tremor in his hand. Wore a long grey coat. Looked disappointed when he left. Armitage was already flipping through his notes. Lonsdale? It could be, Harriet said quietly. He was nervous when we questioned him. Too eager to provide answers. And he didn't seem surprised when I mentioned the lens had been altered. They'd brought Lonsdale in for a second conversation. This time, Harriet took the lead. Her tone cool and deliberate. You saw her again, didn't you? He blinked. The woman? Vera. Whatever name she gave you. No. I mean, I saw her once in the lab. Never again. You visited her boarding house last week. He froze, his fingers clenched. We have an eyewitness, Harriet said. And you left rather quickly. What did she say to you? I just wanted to know what she wanted from him. He burst out. I cared about Ashcroft. He was brilliant. Paranoid, yes, but he was right to be. She was bleeding him dry. Asking questions, watching him work, pushing him toward things he wouldn't have done alone. And you didn't tell us this. She threatened me. She said if I spoke, I'd end up like him. Armitage stepped forward. She said that exactly. She said, you're clever enough to know silence is safer. I understood what she meant. Harriet studied him. The fear was real, but fear didn't always mean innocence. Why didn't you go to the police? Because I thought she was bluffing. I thought Ashcroft would see through her. Did you touch the lens? No, I didn't even know where it was. I swear. Harriet believed him, mostly. But Lonsdale was hiding something. His shame was visible. Whether it was fear, guilt, or complicity remained unclear. After he was dismissed, Harriet sat again in the red curtained room, replaying the voices of the day. Godfrey's evasion, Elsie's too perfect memory, Lonsdale's fear, and behind them all the shadow of Vieira, who moved quietly and left only disruption in her wake. Ashcroft had warned them. She is watching me still. But Harriet Vane now suspected something darker. Vieira wasn't watching anymore. She was waiting. Rain began tapping against the windows of Ashcroft House, soft at first, then more insistent, as if the weather itself were closing in on the tangle of lies Harriet Vane now faced. She remained in the study long after the others had left, the red curtains drawn back to allow the last grey light of the afternoon to spill across the floor. The letter in Ashcroft's hand was no longer just a warning. It was a signal flare from a man who'd realized too late that every person close to him had a reason to see him fall. The woman, Vieira or Vera, was the most obvious figure of suspicion. But nothing about her presence fully explained the timing, the method, or the concealed lens that had been altered to deliver death with surgical precision. Harriet turned again to the letter, rereading the line. I fear I've built something she will use again. If it was only about murder, why would Ashcroft fear its repetition? Inspector Armitage returned at dusk with a file tucked beneath his arm. Passports are fake, he said without preamble. The boarding house gave us a copy. No records of Verakova anywhere. Whoever she is, she's used aliases before. Harriet nodded. She didn't need a real name. She only needed access and silence. Armitage placed the file on the desk. We've also looked into Ashcroft's financials. A few unusual things. He transferred a large sum, £5,000, to a private account in Zurich. Uncharacteristic considering his frugal habits. Happened 2 weeks before his death. To whom? Account is under the name M.L. Wexler. Bank's being tight-lipped, but we've requested more information. Wexler, Harriet murmured. Not a name I've heard here. Could be hers or a partner's. Armitage raised an eyebrow. And there's more. He changed his will 2 days before he died. Removed a minor beneficiary, Dr. Lonsdale. Harriet leaned back. So Edward had more to lose than he let on. It's a motive if nothing else. Perhaps. But Lonsdale strikes me as the type who'd collapse under the weight of guilt, not precision. Armitage smirked. That leaves us with the colonel, the maid, and the ghost in the red coat. I'm not finished with the maid yet, Harriet said. Her story fits too well. She says she overheard an argument, and the phrase she quoted, "Then someone else will," was conveniently dramatic. You think she made it up? I think she embellished, possibly more. They brought Elsie in again, this time to the study. The change in setting unsettled her. Harriet gestured to the hidden cabinet. You said you cleaned here regularly. You never noticed this latch. Never dusted the shelf. Elsie flushed. I only cleaned what I was told to. You were told to ignore this shelf? No. The professor didn't like people touching his books. And yet you remembered a single phrase from a muffled conversation behind closed doors. Odd, isn't it? Elsie opened her mouth, closed it, then whispered, I heard more than I said. I just didn't want to get involved. Tell us now, she said. She said, you're not the only genius in the room. And he said, you're not the first to try and outthink me. Then she laughed. That's all I heard clearly. Harriet glanced at Armitage. That was different, and it sounded like Vera hadn't come to kill Ashcroft. At least not immediately. It sounded like rivalry, one laced with mutual awareness of the stakes. What happened to the notebook? Elsie blinked. What notebook? Professor Ashcroft always kept one on his desk. The pages were torn from the spine. That's not normal. Where is it? I didn't touch it. But someone did. Maybe Vera took it. Maybe you did. Maybe you were paid. I swear I didn't. Harriet cut her off. No. If you're hiding something else, I suggest you come forward before someone else does it for you. Elsie looked cornered, but no further words came. Harriet let her leave. Alone again. Harriet returned to the motive. The room was a crucible of pressures, scientific discovery, secrecy, pride. Every person circling Ashcroft had something to gain or protect. Lonsdale, dropped from the will and cut out from the professor's future. Godfrey, protective of Ashcroft but wary, perhaps jealous of the newcomer. And Elsie, underestimated, overlooked yet privy to movements no one else saw. But something kept nagging at Harriet. Why the lens? Why engineer such a precise method of death, then vanish without ensuring it looked natural? It was a message. A demonstration. This wasn't just about eliminating Ashcroft, it was about proving something. She reviewed Ashcroft's last few publications. Nothing controversial, but in his notes, she found one peculiar line, tucked away in the margin, a letter to a colleague. If perfected, the beam could be weaponized for silent neutralization. Highly experimental, not for sharing. Yet that word yet. Ashcroft had invented something dangerous, something silent, something invisible. And someone wanted it for themselves. She returned to the colonel. He was in the library now, his face haggard, a drink untouched on the side table. You said Ashcroft was distracted, Harriet began, worried, but not paranoid. Yes. Did he ever mention concerns about military interest in his work? The colonel's jaw tightened. He thought the Defense Office had eyes on him, thought they might try to steal his notes. I told him it was nonsense. Was it? He looked away. He was brilliant, but brilliant men make enemies in strange places. Did you see any letters, visitors, unusual conversations? There was a man once, foreign, maybe German, tall, stiff manner, came with documents. I wasn't present long. Ashcroft asked me to leave. Said it was academic. And this was recent? A few months ago. Harriet's thoughts whirled. The Zurich account, the red-coated woman, the foreign visitor, a web of connections far wider than jealousy or revenge. But it was still incomplete. Armitage entered with a new detail. The Zurich bank responded. Account Wexler was opened by wire, linked to an English address. The same street as Edward Lonsdale's former residence. Harriet felt her stomach knot. Bring him in, she said quietly. No, but she knew it wouldn't be that simple. The web was tightening, yes, but it wasn't Lonsdale who had spun it. It was someone smarter, someone patient, and someone who knew how to disappear behind red curtains, broken glass, and well-rehearsed lies. The morning brought with it a brittle sense of triumph. Inspector Armitage, bleary-eyed but resolute, strode into the Ashcroft study where Harriet Vane stood over a half-burnt envelope retrieved from the fireplace. In her hand was the charred edge of a bank slip, one that had almost vanished in smoke but, for the faint inked signature still legible, E. Lonsdale. We've got him, Armitage said with finality, setting a folder down on the desk. Lonsdale wired £5,000 to the Zurich account, using an identity linked to that street address. Traced through a proxy, but it leads back to him. The handwriting on the slip matches notes we pulled from his flat. Harriet said nothing, watching the ash flake from the paper like grey snow. Armitage opened the file, revealing photographs, bank transfers, a forged passport with Lonsdale's photo beneath a different name, and lastly, a receipt from a photographic supply company. Lens equipment matching the modified piece that had killed Professor Ashcroft. He's disappeared. Armitage went on. Flat cleared out last night. Neighbors said they saw a cab collect him around 11. False trail to Euston Station, but the rail staff remember him. Ticket to Edinburgh. We've passed word to the Scottish Constabulary. Harriet's brow furrowed. Too easy. Armitage gave a half laugh. We've got motive means opportunity and now he's fled. What more do you need? She lifted the charred slip. A man who plans this carefully doesn't wait until the night before the discovery to run. And why burn only part of this? Why leave a clue so conveniently half destroyed? You think it was planted. I think it's performance. Lonsdale was bitter, yes, but this was meticulous. Not impulsive. Not messy. But the lens was purchased in his name. Perhaps. But what if he wasn't the one who modified it? What if he was only the mule, used to make a connection that someone else wanted us to follow? Before Armitage could answer, a constable knocked briskly. Ma'am, there's someone downstairs. Says she knew Professor Ashcroft. Wouldn't leave a name, just said you'd want to see her. Harriet exchanged a glance with Armitage. Bring her up. When the door opened, it was not the person either expected. A woman stepped in, older than Harriet had anticipated, dressed plainly but with sharp, clever eyes. She walked with the confidence of someone used to being underestimated. I'm Margaret Lonsdale, she said. Ahmed's sister. Armitage stiffened. We weren't informed he had family. No reason to be, she said calmly. Edward and I haven't spoken in nearly a year, not since he left the university. But I saw the newspaper report about Ashcroft's death. I came because I know my brother didn't kill him. You're certain of that? Harriet asked. Yes, because Edward is brilliant, but cowardly. He'd drown in debt before lifting a finger to harm someone like Ashcroft. But there's more. Someone's been using his name. Margaret opened her handbag and produced a letter, its paper crisp and expensive. The writing, Harriet noted, was careful, too careful. Each letter curved with identical neatness, too precise for Edward's known scrawl. He sent me this 3 days ago, said he was in trouble. That someone had drawn him into a scheme under false pretenses. Said he couldn't go to the police because it would make him look complicit. Harriet read it. The tone was fearful, evasive. The letter hinted at someone he referred to only as the designer, a person who had convinced him to buy equipment for a demonstration. It included a warning. If they frame me, no, it wasn't about the money. It was about the idea. Took the letter, his mouth a tight line. Could still be a decoy, a play for sympathy. Perhaps, Harriet allowed. But then why not destroy this? She turned to Margaret. Did he say where he was going? No, but he included a sketch of the machine he helped build. Harriet examined the paper. Drawn in pencil, faint, but with annotations in Ashcroft's hand. He didn't design this, she whispered. Ashcroft did. Which means, Armitage muttered, he had access to Ashcroft's notes. Or someone gave him access, Harriet said. She rose and moved toward the bookshelf. The red curtain stirred slightly in a passing draught. It was subtle, but it reminded her of something. Something not quite right in the room since the beginning. The curtains were too heavy for the season. Ornate, but unlike the rest of Ashcroft's preferences, they felt added on. A flourish. A shield. She pulled them aside. Behind them was not just glass, but a small gap between the wall and the frame, as if something had been wedged there. Carefully, Harriet reached in. Her fingers met paper. A notebook. She drew it out. The cover bore no title, but inside were Ashcroft's notes, scattered observations, formulas, entries dated weeks apart. Near the end, a single page was circled in red. Beneath it, one line. She thinks I don't know what she's after. The next entry, have locked the final schematic in the cabinet. Changed the passcode. Harriet closed the book, heart racing. He knew, she said aloud. He knew she was manipulating him. He didn't name her. But he anticipated betrayal. He hid the final design. Armitage looked stunned. Then Lonsdale didn't have it. No, which means he couldn't finish the machine. Only one person could. The one who understood the principle from the beginning. The one Ashcroft underestimated. A silence fell. The false victory was crumbling. Harriet turned to the constable. Get word to every station north. Find Edward Lonsdale, but don't stop there. Search for anyone using aliases linked to photographic companies. And pull records of any woman with foreign ties who's worked in optics or engineering. Armitage met her eyes. You think she's still in England? I think she never left the house. He frowned. What do you mean? Harriet looked toward the far corridor, the shadows long and reaching as evening fell once more. The staff had been questioned, but not everyone had been truly seen. She left a coat behind a red one. A deliberate distraction. Everything she's done has been layered. Performed, she wanted us chasing Edward. Then who is she? Harriet's voice was quiet. Someone brilliant enough to make Ashcroft believe she was a student. and vanish into thin air after killing him. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, and the curtains stirred once more, like a theatre before the final act. Harriet Vane stood by the open window, notebook in hand, the last amber rays of daylight brushing across the pages of Ashcroft's scrawl. She flipped back to the earlier entries, looking for patterns not yet noticed. The name of the designer still hovered like smoke in the back of her mind, unnamed, unspoken, yet increasingly present. She had the sense that the crime didn't start here in this house, nor with Edward Lonsdale, but somewhere earlier, deeper. The roots stretched backward, coiled tightly in the shadows of forgotten time. She tapped her pen thoughtfully against the edge of the page. "Margaret," she called softly. The older woman, sitting quietly in the armchair, looked up. "When did Edward first become interested in optics?" Margaret hesitated. "Not during university. Before that, actually. We spent part of our childhood in Lausanne. My father was consulting with a research institute. Edward was just 12 or so, but fascinated by a physicist who lived across the lake, a Dr. Koenig. He let Edward sit in on his experiments sometimes." "Koenig," Harriet repeated slowly. "Do you remember his full name?" "Otto Koenig. He worked with diffraction lenses, very specialized. Later he was arrested, I think, during the war. Some scandal involving industrial theft. We lost touch." Harriet's mind lit up. She turned to Armitage, who had been quietly going through a stack of Ashcroft's letters. "Inspector, I need a full list of Ashcroft's former students and associates who had overseas ties during the interwar years, particularly in Switzerland." "That's a long net," he said, already rising, "and one worth casting." As Armitage left, Harriet returned to the notebook. The circled entry again drew her eye. "She thinks I don't know what she's after." There was something else about the phrasing, too precise, almost performative. Ashcroft had been writing for someone, perhaps himself, perhaps posterity. Her eyes drifted toward the margins where a faint notation had been scribbled. "See Koenig's work, 1928 paper on adaptive optics. Never published. Why?" She felt the shift, the sudden change of pressure that always accompanied the click of revelation. She moved quickly to Ashcroft's cabinet, where he stored rare journals, and began pulling them down, one after another. Halfway through the stack, she found what she didn't expect: an envelope, tucked between two unrelated journals, addressed in thick, aged ink. It was unopened. With care she slit the flap and slid out a folded letter and an old black and white photograph. The letter was dated 1929 and written in German. She skimmed the signature Otto Koenig. Harriet could read enough to catch the tone, deferential but urgent. Koenig spoke of continued risks, and warned Ashcroft against sharing certain optical techniques, beyond your most trusted circle. He referenced a woman only once. "She is young, yes, but she understands more than either of us predicted. She sketches what I only imagine. Be careful, Leonard." Harriet turned to the photo. 3 figures stood by a lakeside laboratory: Ashcroft, Koenig, and a girl no older than 17, her dark hair pinned up, eyes sharp beneath a fur-lined coat. The back bore a scribble in faded pencil: OKLA and C, just the initial C. Harriet moved swiftly, notebook under arm, to the small upstairs library where Ashcroft kept his personal correspondences. She knew now what to look for: references to a C, especially among the older letters. It didn't take long. A letter from 1934. A recommendation written by Ashcroft to an American university. "Clara Koenig is, without question, one of the most incisive minds I have ever encountered. Her early work in reflective distortion and adaptive clarity challenges even my understanding. I trust her implicitly, though I regret she has chosen to leave England for other pursuits." Harriet exhaled slowly. Clara Koenig, not a student, not recently. A colleague, possibly more. She turned to Margaret. "Do you remember a woman ever visiting your family when you were abroad?" "Someone named Clara." Margaret shook her head. "No, but there was talk once that Koenig had a daughter. People whispered she was more brilliant than him, and twice as peculiar. Disappeared after he was arrested. Some said she changed her name." Harriet nodded grimly. "And I think she came to England. Not to continue the work, but to claim what she believed was hers." She paced slowly to the window again, staring down at the drive where the trees now cast long, ink-stained shadows across the gravel. The murder wasn't random, it wasn't even modern. It was the final act in a story decades old, a rivalry, a theft of ideas, a genius unrecognized by the world and determined to exact her legacy by force. Ashcroft had kept Clara Koenig's name out of the official records. Likely he knew her reputation could tarnish his own, but she had remained close, perhaps in secret, hiding behind disguises, names, teaching assistants, all manner of carefully layered masks. And finally she had struck. Harriet turned back to the photograph. The fur-lined coat, the severe hair. She remembered that red coat left behind in Ashcroft's dressing room days before the murder. Garish, bold, but not forgotten. "Inspector." She called as Armitage returned, holding a folder. "We need to re-interview the housekeeper." She said no one came to visit the professor that final night. But someone must have. He handed her the file. No record of any Clara Koenig post-1940. But there is a Claire Keane, British citizen, obtained credentials from Zurich, worked in optical labs across Europe. Employed under various names, Claire Kahn C. Kerr. Last known residence was in Oxfordshire. Claire Keane. Herrick tidy anglicization. No wonder no one saw it. She's gone underground, Armitage said. Left Oxford 3 months ago. Rented a flat in Cambridge under the name C. Kent. Paid in cash. Harriet folded the photograph and tucked it into her coat. She's not far. And she won't run. Not until she finishes what she started. Outside. The shadows had grown longer still, stretching their limbs across Ashcroft's estate, as if drawing the curtains for the night. But Harriet knew the stage wasn't empty yet. The past had returned to claim its final act, and Clara Koenig, whoever she now called herself, was somewhere in the wings, waiting. Rain glazed the windows of Ashcroft Hall in rhythmic beads, softening the world outside into a blur of slate and green. Inside the study, Harriet Vane stood with arms folded, eyes fixed on the photograph of the girl in the fur-lined coat, Clara Koenig, or Claire Keane, or whatever name she wore now. The official channels were running slow. The search for C. Kent in Cambridge had returned little but an empty flat and a landlady who remembered her as the quiet type, liked her curtains drawn. The same red curtains. Harriet had felt the prickling intuition before, and now it struck like a nail driven into wood. Claire had left more than clothing behind. She had left a message. She returned to the crime scene with Armitage, the air inside still thick with dust and disuse. The red curtains remained drawn, though time had made them lose some of their vibrancy. Harriet pulled them apart and let the grey light spill across the empty room. She moved to the armchair, Ashcroft's reading chair, and sat, eyes narrowed, letting the space speak. Then she closed her eyes. Let's suppose, she murmured, that Claire wanted Ashcroft to see something specific in this room. Something he alone would notice. Armitage shifted beside her. You think she staged it? No. She counted on familiarity. Harriet opened her eyes and reached for the side table where a crystal decanter sat untouched. Tell me, Inspector, what do you see here? Glass. A decanter. Books. Fireplace. No, she said, rising. What you don't see is the point. The room is almost sterile, too neat, too precise. No ash in the fireplace, no stray papers, nothing personal. Except, she turned sharply to the decanter, then unscrewed the silver top and tipped it sideways. A single drop of dark liquid clung to the edge. Whiskey. Harriet held the scent beneath her nose and then recalled not whiskey. Adine. Old but unmistakable. Armitage frowned. That's odd. Why would someone store iodine in a decanter? To test for starch, Harriet said softly. In the presence of starch, iodine turns blue-black. A basic chemical reaction. Ashcroft would have known it, so would Claire. She stood, glancing around. Fetch me a white cloth. Moments later, with a linen napkin in hand, she dipped it into the iodine. Nothing happened. Then she crossed to the bookshelf and selected a particular volume. One Claire would have seen on her visits, The Principles of Reflection and Refraction. Ashcroft had cited it in lectures. She flipped to the title page, paused, and swabbed the inner edge with the cloth. The white linen bloomed dark blue. Paper starch, Harriet whispered. But only on this page. Armitage leaned in. Invisible ink. No, a message concealed by expectation. People rarely check the title page of a well-thumbed book, but Ashcroft would have noticed. He probably did. She returned to the flat, unmarked page, and held it to the window. A faint indentation became visible, as if someone had written over it then torn the top page away. Harriet carefully shaded it with a pencil, bringing out the ghosted words. You took what was mine. Time to return the favor. Not a confession, a taunt, a challenge. Later that evening, Harriet gathered all 3 primary suspects, Margaret Lonsdale, Stephen Price, and Diana Caldwell, under the guise of a follow-up interview. She had no intention of speaking plainly. Instead, she would use the oldest trick in the book, suggestion. Let guilt find its own voice. They sat in the library, the fire crackling in uneasy silence. Harriet moved about the room with deliberate slowness, placing the iodine-stained cloth on the table without explanation. I've been reviewing Ashcroft's final days, she began, and it seems he anticipated someone's betrayal. Someone close. Perhaps even someone in this room? Margaret flinched. Barely, but Harriet noted it. Stephen's face remained still, but he pressed a finger to his collar. Diana, seated near the edge of the fire, smiled politely. Was always paranoid. Paranoia is a function of pattern recognition, Harriet said. Ashcroft saw patterns where others saw coincidence. She walked over to the decanter and poured a small amount of iodine onto a blank napkin. He believed someone would use his own methods against him. Deception by familiarity, but he left behind a test. A chemical one. Stephen frowned. What sort of test? Oh, something quite elementary. A reaction that reveals more than it hides. She dabbed the cloth again and turned to Margaret. Would you mind, terribly, if I borrowed your scarf? Margaret blinked. I suppose not. She handed it over. Harriet pressed the cloth to the scarf, then to Stephen's sleeve, then to the lace at Diana's wrist. Nothing changed. She hadn't expected it to. But what mattered was how they reacted. Stephen watched the process like a man staring down a firing squad. Margaret fidgeted, eyes darting to the window. And Diana? Diana didn't look at the cloth. She looked only at Harriet, her smile unmoved. Curious, Harriet said, setting the items aside. No reaction. But the fear was palpable. Stephen exhaled sharply. Is this supposed to be a game? Harriet met his gaze. No, Mr. Price. But it's useful to know how each of you handles suspicion. That's the test. The tension crackled more loudly than the fire. Diana stood. This is absurd. Are we suspects or subjects in a psychological experiment? Harriet smiled. Both. You see, deception doesn't always lie in what people say, but in how they behave when they believe they are being watched. Diana turned to leave, her heels clicking sharply across the floor. Then she paused at the door, glancing back. You'll need more than schoolgirl chemistry to find a killer. I already have what I need, Harriet replied softly. After they left, Armitage emerged from the hallway where he had watched the entire performance. Nothing concrete, he said. But everything pointed, Harriet replied. Stephen is scared, but not of guilt, of implication. Margaret is hiding something she doesn't fully understand. And Diana's mask didn't slip at all. That's the most damning thing. She returned to the fire, retrieving the decanter and cloth. The real killer has rehearsed every expression. But everyone cracks under the right pressure. Even her. Armitage looked thoughtful. So what's next? Harriet stared into the flames. We make her rehearse again, and this time, she won't know the cue. Rain fell again the next morning, a sullen drizzle that seemed to cling to everything, as if the very air resisted letting go of what it had gathered overnight. Harriet Vane rose earlier than usual, her thoughts circling the evening's performance. The three suspects had reacted just as she had hoped, but not in the way the police would understand. There had been no confession, no confrontation, only a shiver in the surface of their composure. Still, it was enough for her to press forward. Until now. She reached Ashcroft's study at 8, expecting to find everything as she had left it. Instead, she opened the door to the sharp scent of fresh polish, the sight of the decanter missing, the napkin gone, and worst of all, the book, The Principles of Reflection and Refraction, no longer on the shelf. She stood motionless for a beat. Then she turned to the maid, who had been dusting the corridor. Has anyone been in this room this morning? The girl looked startled. Only Mr. Fenwick, miss. The curator from St. Sed's. Said he was collecting something for the university archives. Had a key. Harriet's mouth tightened. Did he say which item? No, miss, but he had a box. He was in and out before breakfast. Harriet didn't wait for more. She stepped back, mind already turning over the implications. Fenwick. Of course. The same man who had catalogued Ashcroft's donations. He had access and motive. He could claim institutional authority to remove evidence and have it quietly disappear into the black hole of archival processing. She strode out into the rain without her coat and headed straight for St. Sed's. Fenwick was in his office, surrounded by paper and a strong smell of pipe smoke. He didn't rise when she entered. Miss Vane, he said, unsurprised. You're early. I could say the same. You've taken Ashcroft's book. Fenwick blinked slowly. Belongs to the college. It belonged to the victim. It's also part of an active investigation. His lips thinned. If you're accusing me of tampering with evidence, I'm accusing you of knowing more than you admit. You catalogued Ashcroft's entire personal library, didn't you? I did. Then you knew that book had not left the shelf in years, until recently. You removed it because you suspected, or perhaps knew it held something relevant. He leaned back, his fingers steepled. Miss Vane, there are politics here. You may be a brilliant novelist, but you're not immune to how this world works. Ashcroft had enemies, yes, but he also had protectors. Men who preferred his secrets stay buried. Her voice dropped. So there are secrets. Fenwick didn't answer, which was answer enough. By noon she returned to Ashcroft Hall and found Inspector Armitage waiting grimly outside. The decanter and cloth are gone, he said without preamble. Cleaner says a man matching Fenwick's description came in early, claimed university authorization, and left with a satchel. Then it's begun, Harriet said. Someone is scrubbing the trail? Armitage exhaled through his teeth. We've got nothing physical left. No letter, no iodine reaction, no book. I spoke to the chief. He wants to wrap this up. Says the college is pushing for discretion. But this was never about physical evidence alone, Harriet said. Clara left us something more fragile. Something a man like Fenwick can erase. What's that? Memory. They spent the afternoon interviewing everyone who had entered the study since the murder. Several remembered the red curtains. One recalled seeing the book out of place weeks ago, spine cracked oddly, as if it had been opened too far. Another, one of the junior fellows, mentioned that Ashcroft had started receiving letters with no return address, and that his mood had darkened during those weeks. But it was the housekeeper, Porter, who offered the strangest detail. He stopped playing the phonograph, she said. Duck Ashcroft, I mean. Every morning, without fail, he played the same record, some violin piece. Then one day he just stopped, threw the record in the fireplace. I had to sweep the fragments myself. Harriet's brow furrowed. Do you remember what the piece was? Something foreign. A woman's name was written on the sleeve. In pencil, I think. She raced to the fireplace in the study, now swept clean. But the waste bin still had ash, and Harriet carefully sifted through it with gloves until she found a curved shard of black shellac with a faint etching Koenig. She signed the record. Harriet murmured. Claire left her name. The link was undeniable now. Claire Koenig had not only known Ashcroft but had once meant enough to him that he played her music daily. Something had soared badly. The record destroyed, her name struck from his routines. Their past had become a threat. But if someone had gone to such lengths to erase the book, the cloth, the chemical traces, why leave the record shard? Harriet stared at it, chilled. Because they didn't know it was here, she said aloud. And now they'll come looking. That night, she placed the fragment in a locket box and slid it into the lining of her coat. She no longer trusted even the evidence room at the station. Someone was watching every step. A phone call came just past 10. Armitage's voice was clipped. Margaret Lonsdale's cottage, ransacked. Was anything taken? He hesitated. Just one thing, a music score. No other valuables touched. Harriet felt her breath catch. Claire's composition, possibly. Margaret says it had handwriting in German. She didn't think it mattered. It mattered. Whoever was hiding Claire's identity was now accelerating their efforts. The red curtains, the book, the record, and now the score. They weren't just pieces of a personal history. They were a confession waiting to be pieced together, and someone feared what the whole might say. As she hung up, Harriet caught sight of her reflection in the window, rain streaking behind her like 100 broken lines converging on a vanishing point. The evidence was slipping from her fingers, but the shape of the truth, shrouded, elusive, was still there, behind the fog, and someone was trying very hard to erase it before she could see it clearly. The morning after the break-in at Margaret Lonsdale's cottage dawned grey and wind-swept. Harriet Vane barely slept, her thoughts moving in tight circles. The fragment of Claire's record weighed heavily in her coat pocket, like a relic from a ghost that refused to stay buried. She could feel the pressure mounting. Whoever was orchestrating the concealment was desperate now, and desperation made people bold, unpredictable, and dangerous. She met Armitage outside Sed's gates, both of them wind-blown and unspeaking for a moment. The streets were quiet, unnaturally so for the hour. A robin hopped on the slick iron railing and then darted away, as if it too sensed what was coming. Margaret Lonsdale hasn't turned up, Armitage said finally. Didn't come home last night. Neighbors saw her walking toward the meadow path just before dusk. She was carrying a book. Harriet's heart sank. She never arrived at the library. No one's seen her since. The meadow path wound behind the chapel ruins and sloped gently down toward the river. A secluded stretch shadowed by heavy trees. Harriet knew it well. So did anyone who had lived in Oxford long enough to understand its silences. They followed the route quickly, boots sinking in wet grass, Armitage's officers fanning out in widening circles. It was 10 minutes before a young constable let out a sharp cry. The others converged instantly. She was lying beneath the old willow at the bend of the river, shoes soaked, one glove missing. Her eyes were open but unfocused, her skin pale beneath a scattering of bruises. A thin line of blood trickled from her temple. Beside her was a crumpled page torn from an old ledger, the ink smeared by rain. One word stood out in bold, careful pen Vizion. Harriet knelt beside her, pressing fingers to her wrist. She's alive, she said, breathless with relief. But barely. The ambulance took her away before she could regain consciousness. Armitage turned to Harriet, face grim. You recognize the word? It's German, she said. It means forgive. They stood in silence, the weight of the message hanging between them. This wasn't just a warning, it was a command. Margaret had seen something, understood something, and now someone wanted to silence her before she could share it. Back at the college, Harriet sat alone in the study again, staring at the red curtains as they stirred in the wind. Everything was moving too fast. Claire's name had surfaced, the music had resurfaced, and Margaret had been attacked the moment she showed too much curiosity. But who had known what she knew? Who had watched her close enough to strike that quickly? The answer came not in a fact, but a feeling. a weight behind her eyes that had been building for days. She needed to break the pattern, step outside the tidy English framework of polite interviews and archived clues. She took the shard of Claire's record from her coat and laid it on the table beside the torn note. She stared at both until a shape began to form. Claire had left breadcrumbs, not just evidence. A trail built from symbols, music, language, memory. Ashcroft had tried to destroy them, but someone else, someone still in the present, was following those same steps, cleaning them away. Which meant they weren't acting alone. This wasn't a solitary hand, it was a shared secret. She rang the college archivist, Mr. Granby, asking for old faculty rosters. Within the hour, she was seated with thick ledgers, names and dates scrawled in fading ink. She traced them backward 1947-1946, until one listing caught her eye. Clara Koenig, visiting lecturer in music theory 1945-46. Her pen hovered. Claire had been here under a different spelling. She wasn't Ashcroft's victim only in a romantic sense. She had been part of the college, officially. Beneath her name, listed as the recommending fellow, Dr. Julian Ashcroft. Harriet sat back. So Ashcroft had brought her in. Which meant their relationship hadn't been casual, it had professional underpinnings, power, influence, perhaps even exploitation. And beside that name, under the collegial oversight column, was another Dr. Thomas Fenwick. Her blood chilled. Fenwick hadn't just catalogued Ashcroft's books. He'd known Claire from the beginning. He'd worked with her. The door banged open without warning. Armitage burst in, white-faced. "We've got a body." Harriet froze. "Ooh." Fenwick. They found him slumped in his office chair at St. Sed's, a bottle of laudanum on the desk beside him, his lips blue and motionless. The window was cracked open, letting in the rain. A note was pinned neatly to his jacket lapel. It read only "Forgive us both." There was no struggle, no forced entry. The signs pointed to suicide, but Harriet felt no satisfaction. Only dread. She scanned the shelves behind him, row after row of archives. Something was off. She approached the central filing cabinet. It was open slightly, one drawer not pushed all the way in. Inside, several files had been disturbed. She pulled them free. Among them was a slim folder marked Koenig, Clara, personal and academic correspondence. But the folder was empty. She turned to Armitage. He didn't kill himself to escape guilt. Someone staged this, took what he had and left him as the fall guy. Armitage swallowed. "You think it's the same person who went after Margaret?" "I think we're dealing with someone who's been playing both sides, wiping out loose ends while letting us chase ghosts." "But why now, after all these years?" Harriet glanced back at the empty folder. "Because the past isn't buried," she said softly. "It's been waiting." The case had veered suddenly into deeper. Claire's story was no longer just one of betrayal. It was one of institutional complicity, of silenced voices and long-repressed truths. And now, with Fenwick gone and Margaret barely clinging to life, Harriet knew she had to move quickly. The final player, the one who had truly orchestrated this, was still out there, and if she didn't act fast, they wouldn't stop at evidence. They'd come for her next. Rain smattered the stone paths of Oxford as Harriet walked swiftly across the quad. The collar of her coat turned up against the chill. The college bell tolled noon, slow and solemn, its echo stretching across centuries of silence and scholarship. Fenwick's death had changed the atmosphere, as if some ancient curse had awakened. And yet Harriet felt no fear, only a sharpened urgency. The pieces were all here, the shape was beginning to form. She could sense it beneath the surface, like an image pushing up through fog. In her study, the red curtains billowed softly in the breeze. She watched them sway for a long moment, then turned to the files she had carried back from the archives. What few papers remained untouched by the unknown intruder were scattered across the desk: college memos, post-war appointment records, faculty rosters. Most of it was dry, procedural, but one name cropped up in an odd place. Claire Koenig had once shared a borrowed address with another visiting lecturer, Lucille Marchant. Harriet remembered the name from earlier interviews. Lucille had been a junior don at the time, and now she was a revered emeritus fellow, retired to a small stone cottage just outside Headington. Harriet phoned immediately. Lucille's voice was older, warier but precise. "Claire Koenig, my goodness. I haven't heard that name since I left St. Sed's." "She was more than just a visitor," Harriet said. "She left something behind. Something someone is still trying to erase." A pause. Then, gently, Lucille said, "Come by after tea." The rain eased slightly by the time Harriet reached the cottage. Lucille greeted her in a thick wool cardigan, spectacles perched like punctuation at the tip of her nose. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea, but her mind was sharp. "She played beautifully," Lucille murmured, gazing into her cup. "Claire, not just well, beautifully. She could take a simple lullaby and make it feel like a confession." "We shared a flat briefly. She never said much about Ashcroft. But one night she came home very late and very quiet. I asked what was wrong," she said. It isn't music if no one's allowed to hear it. Then she went to her room and locked the door. She wasn't just silenced, Harriet said. She was erased. Lucille nodded. And Fenwick knew it, he always knew it, but he was weak. Ashcroft's circle held a lot of power. Even after the war, people clung to their secrets. Harriet looked down, thinking of the red curtains in her room. The way they moved not with the breeze, but something more insidious like memory. Did Claire leave anything behind? Lucille frowned, then got up slowly and disappeared down the hall. When she returned, she carried a small box wrapped in old newspaper. She left this when she moved out. Said she'd come back for it. She never did. Harriet opened it gently. Inside lay a music manuscript, yellowed but intact. Notes danced across the staves in careful ink. It was titled Velorine Stim, The Lost Voice, a composition in 4 movements. Beneath the title, in tiny writing for those who listened but did not speak, a tremor passed through Harriet's spine. Claire had left her testimony in the only language that couldn't be rewritten, music. Not dates, not accusations, but feeling. Truth coded in tone. She rushed back to the college and played the first movement in her room. The melody was sorrowful at first, rising into tension, then breaking off abruptly, an interruption that left behind silence so deafening it felt deliberate. And that's when it happened. As she sat back, letting the final note fade, her eyes wandered to the writing desk, where the file from the library still lay open. One note in particular caught her attention. An offhand line in Fenwick's handwriting. Record of Claire Kay's library fines waived in exchange for donation of original score to St. Ced's Music Archive 1946. Harriet blinked. She had never seen any music scores in the St. Ced's catalogue, nor had they turned up in Fenwick's office. But if they were donated, she grabbed her coat and ran to the library. The archive's assistant, young and disinterested, shrugged when she asked. Old music collection, no idea, but if it's donation-based, it'd be boxed in the annex. We haven't digitized those yet. The annex was dark and damp, filled with crates and metal shelves that creaked with age. Harriet moved box after box until she found a worn ledger. Inside it Claire K. Nigg's name. 1 donated item. Original manuscript, string quartet in E minor, Velorine Stimmy. But the slot where the manuscript should have been was empty. Only a reference slip remained, in Fenwick's handwriting. Temporarily transferred to faculty office for review March 1946. Harriet stared at the slip. Fenwick never returned it. She returned to his office. The crime scene now cold and sealed with police tape. She called Armitage. You need to open it, she said. There's something still inside. It took an hour for permission. Armitage arrived, looking tired but curious. You really think there's something left behind? He took the manuscript before it was catalogued. That's what our thief was after. They searched for 20 minutes before Harriet spotted the vent cover beneath the radiator. It was slightly ajar. Armitage fetched a screwdriver and eased it free. Inside was a folder. The original score. Harriet held it like an artifact of truth. The full quartet, every note, every line was there. And folded within the final movement was a personal letter. Unsent, from Claire to Ashcroft. She read it aloud to Armitage. You told me once that silence was necessary. That art must suffer in the dark to earn its light. But I know now that silence isn't noble. It's cowardice. I've written everything I cannot say. If I disappear, let this speak for me. Harriet lowered the page slowly. Everything clicked. Ashcroft had stolen Claire's voice, her music, her trust. And when she tried to leave, he had threatened her. The college had protected him. Fenwick had hidden the truth, too afraid to defy the system. And the others, they had all watched, listening. But not speaking, Harriet turned to Armitage. We have it. The motive, the method, the cover-up. It was never just one man's crime. It was an institution's silence. And someone has been trying to keep it that way ever since. Armitage nodded slowly. But who? She looked back at the red curtains stirring faintly in the breeze. There was still one name they hadn't confronted. One man who had hovered at the edges of the story, helpful. Deferential, always just out of reach. She picked up the telephone and dialed. I need to speak with Provost Harrington, immediately. Harrington's office was all wood and books and polished brass, a cathedral of reputation. The provost stood as Harriet entered, a polite smile fixed to his lips. Miss Vane, you said it was urgent. It is, she said, stepping forward, her coat still damp from the rain. I found Claire Koenig's manuscript, the original. It was hidden in Fenwick's office vent, along with a letter, a confession. The smile faded from Harrington's face. She tried to speak out, Harriet continued, but the college made sure she couldn't. Fenwick hid the music, but someone else tried to destroy it. Someone who's still trying to silence her voice. Harrington moved behind his desk, fingers steepled. You're accusing me. I'm asking you, she said, voice steady. What did you do when she came to you in 1946? There was a long silence. Then Harrington turned toward the window, Rain tapped gently against the glass. She came to me, he said finally, his voice distant, brittle. She was distraught. She said Ashcroft had taken something from her music, her dignity. I asked if she wanted to lodge a formal complaint. She said no, she was afraid. Ashcroft had influence, patrons, committee appointments, ties to the ministry. He turned back, eyes dark. I did nothing. You did more than nothing, Harriet said, drawing out the letter. You knew Fenwick had the manuscript. You let it vanish. You let a generation forget her. A flicker of something crossed Harrington's face, grief, perhaps, or shame. But it was gone in an instant. I was a young tutor, he said. Ashcroft had powerful friends, and I thought time would make it easier. Harriet leaned forward. You think murder is time easing something? His lips parted. Murder, Fenwick? Dead? A precise injection. The manuscript missing. Claire's story nearly lost again. Don't tell me it's coincidence. But Harrington didn't deny it. Instead, he said quietly, it wasn't me. Harriet studied him. Then who? A long pause. Then he exhaled. Edwin Seton. The name fell like a stone. Claire's former pupil, she asked, stunned. Her protege, Harrington said. Worshipped her. He was obsessed with her music. When she left, after Ashcroft's betrayal, Edwin was inconsolable. He blamed everyone. Said the college had destroyed her. I always feared. Harriet stepped back. The quiet librarian. Always so accommodating. Always in the background. Why would he kill Fenwick? She said aloud, half to herself. To punish him. For hiding her voice. For burying the only part of her that had survived. She turned sharply, coat swinging as she went. Outside the wind had picked up. The red curtains in her room would be dancing like flames. She found Seton in the music archive alone. He looked up startled. Miss Vane? She walked slowly toward him. I've read the manuscript. And the letter. His face changed. Something internal unraveling behind his eyes. You found it, he whispered. You didn't expect that, did you? Seton rose slowly. I was only trying to protect it. Claire's work, it was sacred. They buried it. They let her suffer. And Fenwick, he locked it in a vent like it was dangerous. He was, Harriet said quietly, afraid. Like the rest of them. Seton's hands clenched. He didn't deserve it. Her voice, her legacy, they silenced her and called it dignity. I wasn't going to let them do it again. Harriet kept her voice calm. Did Claire ask you to do this? He hesitated. She never asked. But I knew. After the war, after what was done to her, she had no family left, no country, only the music. And they took that too. He stepped closer, voice shaking. Fenwick was going to burn it. I heard him. He said it wasn't safe to keep. That it would raise questions. So I waited, I followed him. When I saw the syringe in the lab, he used to self-inject vitamins, I thought. He'll never destroy her again. Harriet stared. So you switched it, and took the manuscript. I meant to preserve it, he said. To share it someday, when it could be heard without fear. But when you arrived, when they reopened the file, I knew it wasn't safe anymore. They'd try to cover it up again. You killed a man, she said coldly. I exposed a silence, he snapped. A silence deeper than any grave. The stillness that followed was almost reverent. Harriet stepped forward, holding out her hand. Come with me, it's over. He looked down at his hands, trembling now. You don't understand, he said softly. She gave me purpose, I kept her alive. You didn't, Harriet replied. She kept herself alive. In every note she wrote. For a moment she thought he might run. But then his shoulders sagged and he handed her the manuscript. He walked with her in silence. By evening, Seton was in custody. Armitage handled it with unexpected gentleness, recognizing in the man not a monster but a soul weathered by grief and obsession. In her room, Harriet sat by the fire. The red curtains hung still at last. The rain had stopped. She opened Claire's final movement and played it, this time to the end. No interruptions, no silence. Just the voice of a woman who had refused to vanish, and the echo of all those who had finally listened. The morning was bright, unnaturally so, as if the sky itself were unaware of the weight the day carried. Harriet Vane stood at the edge of New College Quadrangle, the echo of Claire Koenig's music still humming in her ears. She had not slept much, nor had she wanted to. There was a precision to the moment, too sharp for comfort, too exact to be avoided. Inspector Armitage met her by the chapel steps. He wore the same herringbone coat he had the first day, but now it sagged a little, as if burdened by the truth it had carried across the investigation. He's not resisting, Armitage said, hands in pockets. Seton's confession is detailed. Chillingly calm. Poisoned the vitamin syringe and walked away as if he were shelving a book. But it's not enough, Harriet murmured. There's something more. Armitage frowned. You think there's another player? I think Seton's grief was real, she said. But I don't think he acted alone. He wasn't clever enough to hide the manuscript, shift the blame, and time it all with Ashcroft's death. Someone steered him. someone who knew Claire's history inside and out. They both turned at the sound of brisk steps approaching. Dean Pembroke, breathless and flushed, waved a paper in her hand. "This came through the archives this morning," she panted. "One of the porters found it behind a panel in Koenig's old room." Harriet took it. A brittle envelope, yellowing at the edges, addressed in a tight, looping script, "To be opened only if justice fails me." Inside a single sheet typed, Claire's words, a final account of what had happened between her and Ashcroft. Not a confession but a story of assault, betrayal and silence. But the final paragraph was the most revealing. "I gave my only copy of the complete manuscript to someone I trusted. A scholar, discreet, respected. I believed he would protect it, should harm come to me." Claire had signed it. Beneath, one more line added by hand, in fading inky. Harriet felt the breath hitch in her throat. "N?" Armitage asked, peering over her shoulder. She shook her head slowly. "No. Edwin's middle name is Francis. Each stands for Edward Harrington, the provost." Armitage looked stunned. "But he's the one who helped open the inquiry." "And closed it?" 60 years ago, Harriet said grimly. "He let Ashcroft retire with honors. He allowed Claire's manuscript to vanish. He orchestrated this, first through silence, then through control." Armitage gave a low whistle. "He manipulated Seton." Harriet nodded. "Fed his obsession. Let him think he was avenging Claire. But Harrington was always the puppeteer. It was time. They found Harrington in his study, framed by the same towering shelves, his robe draped like a judge's mantle. He looked up as they entered, expression unreadable. "I suppose this is about Seton," he said almost warily. "No," Harriet said, placing the letter on his desk. "It's about you." He took the envelope, opened it with deliberate slowness and read. His face did not change. "I see," he said after a pause. "You found her words. You kept them buried for decades," Harriet said, voice rising. "You told yourself it was for the good of the college, for its legacy. But really it was to protect yourself. You knew Ashcroft was dangerous. You knew what he'd done, and instead of standing up, you folded." He closed the letter with delicate fingers. "Do you know what it was like in 1946? He asked softly. "The war had just ended. We were rebuilding, not just bricks and mortar but trust, stability. Claire's accusations would have shattered what little was left." "She was shattered," Harriet said, stepping forward. "And you stood by." "I did what I could," Harrington said, now rising, voice taut. "I preserved her work. I kept the manuscript safe, long after others wanted it destroyed." "You fed it to Seton like poison," Harriet snapped. "You gave him just enough to hate, to act, to kill. Seton acted on his own. But with your guidance." Silence pressed between them. Then Harrington exhaled slowly and sat down. "I never wanted anyone to die," he said. "But someone did," Armitage said. "And your hands are as stained as Seton's." Harriet watched him, searching for remorse, for anything beyond wary rationalization. But there was only a tired resignation. She turned to Armitage. "It's enough. We have what we need." Armitage nodded and stepped forward. "Edward Harrington, you're under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct justice and aiding and abetting in the murder of Professor Bernard Fenwick." As the inspector recited the formalities, Harrington stood still, eyes fixed not on them, but on a spot just beyond the window, where the sunlight danced through the leaves, untouched by any shadow within. Later, as Harriet walked back through the quad, the bells from the chapel tower chimed the hour. She passed the music building, where Claire Koenig's work had been catalogued anew, this time under her full name, her story intact. No longer the woman behind the curtain, but the woman whose music would never again be silenced. The dawn had just begun to wash soft light across the ancient spires of the college when Harriet Vane sat alone in her chambers, the crisp paper of the confession and the letter from Claire Koenig resting carefully on the desk before her. The room was quiet except for the distant tolling of the chapel bell and the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. It should have been the moment of closure, the villain unmasked, justice in motion. Yet Harriet's mind churned, restless, unsettled. Something about the case refused to settle like dust on the floorboards. Inspector Armitage had gone to prepare the formal charges against Edward Harrington. The college was beginning to hum with whispers of scandal and triumph, but Harriet could not shake the feeling that a shadow lingered, longer and darker than any they had yet confronted. Her fingers absently traced the looping signature at the bottom of Claire's letter. Edward Harrington. He had pulled the strings, yes, manipulating Seton's obsession, sealing the truth behind years of silence. But what of the manuscript, the final version, the one Claire had entrusted to a trusted scholar? If Harrington truly held that secret, why had it not surfaced during the interrogation? Why had Seton's copy disappeared? And more curiously, why had the manuscript still not appeared among the college's archives after Harrington's arrest? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Armitage stepped inside, his face grim but eyes sharp. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said dryly. Harriet motioned to the papers. "It's not over, Inspector. Harrington may have been the puppet master, but I'm beginning to suspect he was not the true architect of this tragedy." Armitage frowned. "You mean someone was pulling his strings?" "Possibly," Harriet said, standing and moving to the window. "Look closely at the timeline. Harrington had motive, opportunity, and knowledge. But the way Seton was manipulated, it was too precise. Harrington's reckoning came only after Seton's initial actions. If Harrington was the mastermind, he'd have covered all bases more thoroughly." "And the manuscript?" Armitage asked, stepping closer. "The one Claire entrusted to him." Harriet hesitated. "I believe it never was in his possession." Armitage's eyebrows lifted. "Then who else?" The name surfaced unbidden. Lodged in a corner of her memory from earlier interrogations, Dr. Lucille Marston, the college archivist, quietly efficient, never drawing attention but always present when details surfaced or vanished. The woman who had facilitated the transfer of Claire's papers during the early days of the inquiry, who had insisted on cataloguing Ashcroft's and Claire's files personally, claiming a duty to history. Marston, Harriet whispered. She was there at every turn. The perfect gatekeeper. Armitage nodded slowly. She seemed cooperative, even eager to help. Why suspect her now? Harriet's eyes narrowed. Because she's never been questioned properly about the missing manuscript or Seton's true intentions. Because the disappearance of the manuscript benefits someone invested in keeping the college's reputation spotless. And the truth buried. That afternoon, Harriet and Armitage visited the archives under the guise of a routine follow-up. Dr. Marston greeted them with a practiced smile, her hands steady as she filed papers and showed them shelves lined with meticulously labeled documents. "You're quite thorough," Harriet remarked casually, watching Marston's reaction closely. Marston smiled thinly. "History demands accuracy. We owe the past that much, do we not?" Harriet's gaze flicked to a small, locked cabinet behind Marston's desk. "And what of the restricted collection?" "The documents concerning Claire Koenig and Ashcroft." Marston's eyes sharpened. "Those are personal papers, only accessible to those with explicit permission." "Would that include the provost?" Harriet asked. Marston's composure faltered for a fraction of a second. "Edward Harrington was in charge of the archive before me." "Indeed," Harriet said, stepping closer. "Yet no one has seen the complete manuscript since Claire's death. Seton's copy was incomplete, and Harrington denied ever possessing the full work." Marston's fingers tightened around a folder. "The manuscript is lost to time." Harriet fixed her with a steady look. "Or hidden." Later that evening, Harriet reviewed the catalogues Marston had allowed them to see. One entry caught her eye, a reference to a Red Curtain Codex. A name never mentioned before, linked cryptically to Claire's final compositions, and an unpublished series of letters. A visit back to the archive found Marston unusually guarded. When Harriet pressed about the codex, Marston finally admitted it was stored separately, in a sealed envelope tucked behind a false panel within the archive's oldest cabinet. A panel Harriet had glimpsed but dismissed in the days prior. With permission granted reluctantly, they opened the panel, and there it was, a leather-bound folio wrapped in red cloth, the crimson hue matching the curtains from Claire's room. Harriet's heart quickened. Inside were Claire's missing letters, annotated with a precise, scholarly hand, but not Harrington's. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate Marston's. The letters revealed a secret correspondence between Claire and Marston herself, discussing the dangers Claire faced from Ashcroft and others. More damningly, they disclosed Marston's promise to safeguard Claire's work and avenge her should harm come to her. A shiver ran through Harriet. Marston had not only preserved the manuscript but had a personal stake in the tragedy. A motive deeper than academic duty. Before they could react, a shadow crossed the doorway. Marston's voice, cool and steady. "You've found my secret." The final game was beginning. Harriet's mind raced. The quiet archivist, the trusted guardian, the one who knew every corner of the college's history and secrets. She had manipulated the narrative all along, steering suspicion towards Harrington and Seton, while she controlled the manuscript and the truth. "I did what was necessary," Marston said, stepping forward, eyes glittering with cold resolve. Claire's legacy deserved protection. Ashcroft was poison, and those who let him live deserved punishment. But murder, Armitage challenged, hand inching toward his holster. Marston's smile was thin. Sometimes justice wears a darker mask. The room felt smaller, the red curtains framing the confrontation. A final curtain drawn on a play of deceit and ambition. Harriet steadied her voice, knowing the delicate balance between words and action. "It's over, Marston. There's no hiding now." The archivist hesitated, then slowly raised her hands in surrender. The final act of a story twisted with betrayal, hidden motives, and a legacy more complicated than anyone had imagined. As officers moved in, Harriet allowed herself a breath. The last twist had tested her brilliance and resolve, but the truth, at last, was finally unveiled beneath the room with red curtains. The soft clatter of footsteps echoed down the stone corridor as the officers led Dr. Lucille Marston away from the archives. Harriet Vane stood in the dim light filtering through the narrow windows, the crimson-bound codex now secure in her hands. The room still seemed charged, as if the shadows themselves were reluctant to relinquish their secrets. Yet, despite the apparent closure, Harriet's mind remained restless. Marston's calm confession, her chilling declaration that justice sometimes wore a darker mask, it all left a residue of unease. Was this truly the end, or merely another turn in a far more convoluted maze? Inspector Armitage approached, his expression thoughtful. "You seem unsettled," he observed quietly. "After all that, I'd expect relief." Harriet shook her head. "The surface is settled, but beneath it, questions linger. Marston's motives, while twisted, stem from a deep sense of protection. But what about the gaps? Those moments where the timeline didn't quite align? The vanishing manuscript, the altered letters, the silent witnesses." Armitage frowned. "You think someone else is involved?" "Not necessarily," Harriet replied. "But someone who benefited from Marston's actions, someone who knew her intentions but chose to remain in the shadows." Her thoughts drifted back to the tangled web of the college's history. The rivalries, the jealousies, the whispers that had never fully surfaced. Claire Koenig's death had been the spark, but the tinder was decades old, composed of half-truths and unspoken grievances. Harriet spread the letters from the codex across the table once more, each carefully preserved annotation revealing layers of Claire's fears and hopes. "These letters," she said softly, "they weren't just a plea for protection, they were a warning. To those who dared to betray trust." Armitage nodded slowly. "So the question is, did we catch the right person? Or just the one who held the manuscript last?" Before Harriet could respond, a sharp rap sounded at the door. A young constable entered, breathless. "Inspector, you should see this." They hurried down the hall to the evidence room, where a small package had just arrived. An anonymous delivery with no return address. Inside was a plain envelope containing a single sheet of paper. Harriet unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting. "You think it's over. But the truth was never in the manuscript. It's in the silence between the words. Look where no one dares." Armitage frowned. Another message, from the real mastermind. Harriet's heart quickened. The code was clear. The manuscript was a decoy, and the true secret remained hidden in plain sight, overlooked by all. Returning to the archives, Harriet retraced her steps to the small locked cabinet where the codex had been found. Her fingers traced the wood grain, then paused at an almost imperceptible seam. A hidden compartment. Carefully, she pried it open, revealing a brittle, folded parchment tucked inside. Another letter, this one unsigned, but unmistakably in Claire's hand. It detailed a secret project Claire had been working on. An exposé that threatened to unravel a powerful network within the college, implicating names long thought untouchable. The manuscript was merely the surface, this letter was the real target, and the true reason Claire had been silenced. Harriet's eyes scanned the names listed: faculty members, benefactors, even some students, each with motive, means, and opportunity. The crime had been far more than a personal vendetta, it was a carefully orchestrated effort to protect an institution's darkest secrets. As she read, a sudden noise behind her made her spin around. The shadows in the doorway shifted, and for a fleeting moment, Harriet caught the glint of a figure slipping away down the corridor. The trap had failed. Armitage dashed after the shadow, but the figure was gone, vanished into the labyrinthine halls of the college. Harriet clenched the letter tightly. Justice had been served on one front, but the real culprit had escaped, leaving a chilling promise of unfinished business. The mastermind still held the reins, watching, waiting for the next move. Later, as the sun set over the ancient buildings, Harriet addressed Armitage quietly, her voice steady despite the storm within. "We were blind to the subtlety. The way the villain played the long game, using others as pawns. The vanishing manuscript, the false leads, the silent accomplices, all deliberate misdirection. The key was in the silence, in the things no one dared to question." Armitage nodded, the weight of the truth settling in. "So the game isn't over?" "No," Harriet said, eyes fixed on the horizon where shadows lengthened. "It's only just begun." And with that, the detective's mind already raced ahead, piecing together the strands of a mystery deeper than anyone had imagined. Ready to face the darkness yet again, knowing that sometimes, justice is a fleeting shadow, and the truth a secret still waiting to be unearthed. Harriet stepped out into the cool evening air, the fading light casting long shadows across the cobblestones of the college courtyard. The bustle of the day had settled into a hushed quiet, broken only by the distant murmur of students returning to their quarters. Yet, beneath this calm surface, an unsettling tension lingered, a subtle vibration in the atmosphere that refused to be ignored. She adjusted the scarf around her neck, the letter still folded securely in her coat pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the truth still hidden. The events of the past days had carved a path through layers of deceit and ambition. But now, with the mastermind's escape, Harriet understood that the story was far from over. As she walked, her mind replayed the final moments in the archives, the almost imperceptible seam in the cabinet, the secret letter buried beneath layers of wood and dust, and the shadow that had slipped away just as she turned. A small voice in her mind whispered insistently, urging her to hold fast to the fragments of the case that had not yet fully coalesced. The cryptic message left behind haunted her thoughts. Look where no one dares. What was it referring to? Was it merely a taunt, or a genuine clue to the next chapter in this tangled saga? Passing beneath the ancient stone archway that led toward the main gate, Harriet's gaze settled on a seemingly trivial detail, a single faded footprint near the edge of the garden path, half covered by a scattering of autumn leaves. It was easy to overlook, but now it seemed charged with significance. The boot had a unique tread pattern, one she faintly remembered seeing earlier, yet it hadn't been noted by the officers. A careless oversight, or deliberate concealment. Her pulse quickened. The footprint was a thread, a fragile lifeline connecting past secrets to future revelations. She made a mental note to have it catalogued and cross-referenced immediately. Further along, near the fountain where Claire Koenig had spent many afternoons lost in thought, Harriet paused. The water's surface shimmered under the moonlight, rippling gently with a breeze that seemed to whisper secrets just beyond hearing. She knelt, tracing a finger along the edge of the basin, where faint scratches disrupted the smooth stone, marks that resembled the initial CK but were oddly carved backward. A puzzle within a puzzle. Harriet stood, a slow smile curling at the corners of her lips. Claire had left her a final enigma, a subtle signature hidden in plain sight, an invitation for those willing to delve deeper. The game was not merely about catching a murderer or unveiling betrayal, it was about understanding the enduring power of secrets, how they weave through time and memory, shaping destinies long after the players have left the stage. The detective's eyes lifted to the darkening sky, stars beginning to pierce the twilight veil. She knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, more shadows to chase, and riddles to untangle. But that was the nature of her calling. A mystery never truly ends. It evolves, shifting just out of reach, compelling those who seek truth to remain vigilant, patient, and unyielding. With one last glance at the college, the place where so much had been lost and found, Harriet turned toward the city's edge, the first steps into a night filled with promise and peril. Somewhere beyond the horizon, new secrets awaited, ready to unravel and pull her back into the delicate dance between light and dark. And as she disappeared into the labyrinthine streets, the whispered echo of a voice followed, barely audible yet unmistakable. The truth is never buried. It merely waits. Harriet's lips parted slightly, a quiet vow escaping into the night. Then I will keep looking. The case was closed for now. But the story, as all true mysteries do, lingered in the air, alive and breathing, beckoning her forward. And so the detective walked on, the shadows lengthening behind her, ready for the next enigma that would demand her keen eye and relentless spirit.